So you get done recording and editing a podcast episode, and now it's time to upload it and write the description. But what in the world do you put in the description? Well, if you've ever asked yourself that question, you're not alone. And in this video, I'm going to give you the answer to figuring out a description for your podcast episode. Hint, it's called podcast show notes. Let's dive in. I'm Sebastian Rusk, and I help people start a podcast. That's right. Creating show notes for your podcast episode can make filling out that description just that much easier. Now you're probably thinking, great, Sebastian, what are show notes and how is that less work than actually racking my brain to figure out what I want to put in the podcast description? Great question. And in this video, we're going to go over a couple of strategies that you can leverage to get your show notes knocked out and make sure they have everything that your show notes need to include for that podcast episode. Let's dive in. So first things first, let's talk about why you need podcast show notes for your podcast episodes. Well, in short, it allows you to recap the entire episode and basically summarize it in one specific place, which happens to be the description of that podcast episode. That's number one. Next, being able to have show notes helps your listeners better understand exactly what the episode is all about. Sure, they can read the summary, they can thumb through the show notes, but being able to see specific things within the show notes, like any relevant links you may have pointed out during the timestamps within the show notes that show each topic being covered under specific times, people can often skip to exactly what it is they want to listen, or perhaps they've listened to the entire episode and they want to go back and reference some other parts of the episode that they really liked and really enjoyed. Show notes allow you to provide that to your listener and helps the listeners navigate around the episode just that much easier because they're already listening to the podcast. All they have to simply do is look at the description, whether it's Apple Podcast or Spotify or Google Podcast, wherever they consume podcast, the description is going to be available on that podcast episode. If you have detailed show notes, it makes it that much easier for people to go through and go, wow, okay, cool. That's what this episode is all about. Oh, excellent. Oh, and at the 3-minute mark, they talked about underwater basket weaving. I love underwater basket weaving. So it allows people to identify exactly what they want to consume or reconsume, if you will, after they've consumed and listened to the podcast episode. Now let's talk about what the podcast show notes should include. First of all, it's a summary. So it's a brief recap and summary of the podcast episode that can take up a paragraph or two or even three. It should have timestamps. So if the episode's 30 minutes long, whatever's being covered from the 1-minute mark to the 5-minute mark is listed as a topic. Basic timestamps based on exactly what you're covered during the podcast episode. You also want to be able to include any relevant links for your guests that you may have interviewed, so where people can connect and find them, find out more about their business. Your links, your social media links for not only the show, but where you want people to connect with you individually. Any calls to action, any landing pages, any free downloads. Maybe you want to promote your book in there. And then one of my favorite things to do is take past episodes and include links to those past episodes, maybe 2 or 3. Sometimes it's relevant to that specific podcast episode. Maybe it's, well, if you like this episode, be sure to check out other episodes. Again, this is a condensed summary of the entire episode, so people can thumb through that specific episode, but they can also learn more about your guest and learn more about you and answer calls to action and also be able to check out other previous episodes that they may or may not have listened to. SEO, also known as search engine optimization, are a big part of why you want to create podcast show notes for each and every episode. If you're including keywords not only about your show, but about the episode, your guest, the topic that you're discussing, and you turn that into a blog post, let's say you take the show notes that are added to the description and then you turn that into a blog post, well, Google is going to start to index not only the podcast information based on the keywords, the description, the title of the episode. They'll do the same thing on the blog post on your website. Let's say you're creating a blog post for every episode on your actual website. That's where SEO really comes into play and starts to gain some traction for your show, because if it's relevant and Google sees it as relevant, they're going to index it and you'll start coming up in search results based on your topic or the things that you're discussing on your podcast episode. So SEO is a huge part of why you'd want to create podcast show notes for your podcast. So those are the reasons why you want to have podcast show notes for each and every episode. But how in the world do I make these a reality, Sebastian? Great question. Well, first and foremost, I'm a huge fan, and I come from the school of thought that if you don't want to do it and you can't get excited about doing it, or you don't know how to do it, find someone who can. Now, we help folks out with podcast show notes all the time here at the Podcast Launch Lab. So reach out if I can be of an assistance to you in that area. But that's not what I'm here to do. I'm not here to pitch you on using us for show notes. You want to find a freelancer, somebody on your team, an admin, an intern, somebody that's experienced with writing, or specifically podcast show notes, bloggers, people that are used to, again, writing and being able to put together some sort of summary in an organized format in the form of show notes. You can check out Upwork or Fiverr or any place that you find freelancers to find people that would do what's called podcast show notes. Get it off your plate if you can. It's going to run you between $10 and $50 an episode to get done, depending on where you hire a freelancer to help you get that accomplished. You can always do it yourself, but it's going to be time consuming. It requires you to go through the episode, write out a summary, write out the timestamps, include any relevant links, and you can expedite that entire process by outsourcing it on there. So your two options: do it yourself or outsource it to either somebody on your team or to a freelancer that absolutely loves doing podcast show notes. I do not love doing podcast show notes, but my team raves about the work that they get to do. So I'm not going to argue with that process on here. So the lesson here is, if you don't like doing it and it's not an absolute yes, it's an absolute no, at least in my book, and find someone who can get excited about getting your show notes done for you and your podcast. Well, I hope you're leaving this video knowing at least one or two, maybe even three things that you didn't know about podcast show notes and why you need them for your podcast. You got questions about podcast show notes or any podcast related content here on the channel, please leave a comment below. I do respond to each and every one of you lovely people. Until next time,